Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my April wrap-up. So April was a fairly good reading month for me. I read a total of 9 books, which is a little bit less than what I like to read. I like to try to read about 10 books a month if I can, but I did read some longer books this month. And my month was quite busy and I did have vacation. So I'm not beating myself up too badly about it. I'm still pretty pleased with how well I did. So of those 9 books, 2 of the books I read were from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list, which I have talked about in another video. I read both Elmet and Ministry of Utmost Happiness, so I won't discuss those here. You can check out my video if you're interested that I posted a few weeks ago about, or a week ago, I guess, about those 2 books. I also finished 2 audiobooks of the Robin Hobb's Rainwild series. I finished the first 2. The first one was Dragon Keeper and the second one was Dragon Haven. Both were very good. I enjoyed them very much on audio. And then I read 4 nonfiction books and I read 1 collection of short stories. So I would like to just briefly discuss each of these books other than those Women's Prize for Fiction long list books. So as I said, I did finish 2 audiobooks this month and they were both in the Rainwild series by Robin Hobb. The first one of which is Dragon Keeper and the second one of which is Dragon Haven. These are excellent on audiobook. I'd highly recommend them if you like fantasy, epic fantasy. That's definitely a good way to consume them. I would say be patient with Dragon Keeper. It takes a while to get going. The first half of the book, I think I discussed earlier in just a currently reading video a few weeks ago, that it took a while to get into the book. But once I did, the second half of that first book was, the pace picked up. I was really interested in it. I had come to know all the characters. I had come to know the setting. So it was very good. And then, of course, the second book delves more deeply into the whole adventure and was excellent right from the start. And I would describe this set of books takes place in the Rainwild, which is sort of a take on, I would say, an Amazon type environment. And we're following a cast of characters as they accompany dragons from up the river from where they were born to a place that they don't know if it exists anymore, but a fictional, or not a fictional, but a historical city of dragons, that Kelsingra, that the dragons remember, and from their previous, from the memories that they hold of previous dragons. And the humans are there to help them get to this supposed Kelsingra, or to basically get them out of everyone else's hair from where they were born. And it's a great road trip adventure story with a bunch of, very diverse cast of characters. I very much enjoy this series. I'm looking forward to getting started with the 3rd book once I finish my current audiobook. Another book that I read on ebook is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. This is a nonfiction book. It's sort of a collection of, I won't call them essays, but they're loosely connected chapters written from a British citizen's point of view who happens to be black. And she talks about sort of all of the different issues confronting black folks in Britain from historical times right up through present day. She talks about feminism. She talks about, systemic racism. And the thing I guess that struck me the most about this book was how similar the situations and the history is that she describes in Britain to the United States. I think something that I know that I do, and I think that, a lot of what we're taught in America is very U.S.-centric, and so we tend to think that racism is a U.S. problem, and it certainly is not. It's a problem, in a lot of places, and it definitely is a problem in Britain, and it was just striking to me how many issues were very similar to what Eddo-Lodge is describing in her book in Britain as to what happened in America. So that was highly interesting, and I want to thank, Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures and Mercedes over at Mercy's Bookish Musings, the two British booktubers that I heard talking about why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, that really got me interested in the book and made me want to read it. So I'm very glad to get that British perspective on it. I will say also that I read this as a buddy read with Leah from Hide and Seek, who's in Australia, and it was really awesome to get her perspective as a person from a different country, from sort of had the three-country perspective as we discussed that book. And she has recommended a couple of books that give the point of view of an Australian person's point of view, and I want to, and when it comes to racial issues, and I definitely want to pick one of those books up and get that perspective as well to sort of round out my knowledge between the three countries. Another book that I read on ebook, and it was the best book that I read this month, is, let me see if I can get this so you can see it. There we go. The 57 Bus by Dashka Slater. This is a young adult nonfiction book, but it reads like a house of fire. It reads like it's fiction. It's very short chapters. It shifts in perspective from the victim's point of view to the perpetrator's point of view, and I really love the pacing and the way that this book was laid out. For a little bit of background about what the 57 Bus is about, there is a young person who considers themselves agender, and that person, I can't, I'm really bad with names and I've already forgotten the character's, the person's name, but this person considers themselves agender, and even though they look like they are male, they often dress as female and think of themselves as agender, and expect everybody in their family and friend groups to address them as they or them rather than he or she. And I wish I could remember, hold on, let me just see if I can find the name. Sasha, sorry about that, but I just had to have their name. Sasha just living their life on the bus, coming home from school, and a young African-American boy, Richard, lights their skirt on fire. And Sasha suffers very, very bad burns all over their legs, and has to be out of school, and then we follow what happens to both Sasha and to Richard as Richard is arrested and put in jail, and through his court appearance in the trial, and also with Sasha as she recovers from her injuries, has to go back to school, finishes up high school and goes to college. And it was excellent. The narrative was driving. You wanted to know what happens, and the perspectives are excellent. You absolutely have sympathy for Sasha, and I appreciated learning more about a person who is agender, because it's not a thing that I've read about before in any other books that I've read. And Richard, who's not an unsympathetic character. I mean, he's a teenage boy who, at the urging of friends, did a stupid thing that he thought was just going to be a prank. He never imagined that Sasha's skirt would actually catch on fire and light Sasha on fire as well. And his regret and his real guilt and regret that he has done such an act, and the price that he ends up having to pay for his, not well thought out actions. I mean, absolutely, it was terrible. Absolutely, he should be punished for it. Absolutely, Sasha was the one that suffered. But I appreciated that the author also addressed the perpetrator's point of view, and how sometimes kids do stupid ass shit without thinking it through. I mean, I have two teenagers, so I can absolutely attest to the fact that they do stupid shit without thinking about the consequences of their actions. And they don't always, you can't always expect that teenagers are going to think about things the same way that adults do. So I just really appreciated this book, from everything that I learned about a person who's agender to everything that I learned about a person who commits a crime sort of on a spur of a moment, without it being something that they've thought about for a long time, without it being something that they plan to do. It was just a fascinating book, a 5-star read for me. I highly, highly recommend The 57 Bus. If you like nonfiction, and especially nonfiction that's very narrative and almost reads like a thriller. The next thing that I finished was another nonfiction book, and that was Five Presidents, My Extraordinary Journey with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. I've spoken about this before on this channel. This was a book that I buddy read with Patrice Jones, which buddy read extraordinaire. I love reading with Patrice. We have such awesome conversations about the books that we read together, and this one really sparked a lot of conversations, and not only with Patrice, but with members of my family. I just probably drove them nuts with, did you know? Did you know? Can you believe? I feel like I learned so much about these 5 U.S. presidents and what they were really like behind closed doors. And that's to say, without Clint Hill getting into sort of the dirt or the gossip about each of them. He's very circumspect. He's very respectful and very conscious of his position as a Secret Service officer to these 5 presidents. And he certainly had his own demons to fight. He was the guy that was up on the back of the car when John F. Kennedy was shot and assassinated. He was the guy that threw himself over the top of Mrs. Kennedy to protect her. And he certainly had his demons to face because of that. But he also served his country and served the office of the president extremely well for the time that he was a Secret Service officer. So highly recommend, if you are interested in history, especially U.S. history, if you would like to know a little bit more about how the Secret Service works, if you would like to know a little bit more about U.S. presidents, and these particular 5 U.S. presidents had big personalities, and you learn awful lot about them, awful lot of details. I very much enjoyed this book, and I would definitely recommend it. I then finished another nonfiction book in this month, and it was Pandemic, Tracking Contagions from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond by Sonia Shah. This book I first heard about on the New York Public Library's podcast about books and reading, and this book won a nonfiction prize, which I don't remember off the top of my head. This is really an excellent science book. It's very highly readable. I will tell you that it did freak me out a little bit. It very much freaked me out a little bit when this author talks about, you know, some of the contagions and the things like H1N1 and bird flu and swine flu and these things, sort of the newer pandemics that have happened recently in recent years, and what some of pandemics might be as we look into the future. But there's also an awful lot in here about cholera, which is a disease that you might think doesn't impact the modern world anymore, now that we've figured out that you can't drink the water that there's poop in. But evidently we have not really totally learned that lesson, because Haiti, since the earthquake in 2010, has been suffering from cholera outbreaks, and many, many, many thousands of people have died from cholera in Haiti in recent years. So cholera and other contagions that we maybe think of as, you know, historical are still impacting our world today. And we, because of our global systems of travel, it would be very easy for a pandemic to get started before we really knew what was happening. And that is pretty freaky, but it's also really fascinating. So if you like science writing, if you're interested in health issues, if you're interested in sort of how things move around the world and how we might be impacted by that, I would highly recommend this book as well. It's pretty short. It's only like the text itself without the end notes is only like 217 pages long, I think. So it's a short read and highly readable and engaging. So definitely would recommend that. And then the last book that I want to talk about that I finished in April was a short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This book's been all over the place. In BookTube last year, it was up for the National Book Award, I believe, or one of the big literary prizes. I'm not sure if that was the one or not, but I know it was up for a big literary prize. I am not always successful with short story collections, and this one was, I would say, middle of the road successful for me. I really loved the first two stories in this book, and let me see if I can find the titles. The first one's The Husband Stitch, which I know a lot of different people have talked about. That's the one that's sort of the retelling of the fable of the woman who has a ribbon around her neck and her husband's fascinated by it, and she tells him she can't remove it and he just won't leave it alone. And so this is sort of retelling of that fable. Very good. And then the second one was Inventory, which I won't give away what the inventory is of, but I found it fascinating, and it's sort of like dystopia, like the world is experiencing there's an illness that's, you know, very contagious and killing off a lot of people in the world. So it's sort of like an apocalypse dystopia type thing. Really love that story. But then after those two stories, which are normal length short stories, the next story in this collection is called Mothers. I think, is that right? Is that the one? No. Mothers was also a good story. I didn't like it as well as the first two, but it was a good story. It held my interest. And then the next one is Especially Heinous, 272 Views of Law and Order SVU. Now, I don't watch Law and Order SVU. I dislike shows like that. I actually make fun of Law and Order SVU. Every time I hear the opening music to that, I always have to go, rip from the headlines, because that's what it's all about, right? It's rip from the headlines. If you watch that show, you might think that literally every woman and child in the country is getting raped and murdered and assaulted, because that's all that show is about. And it's just, I just can't with that show. So I read this whole thing, which was extremely long for a short story. This is how long that one story is. I don't know if you see, that's not a short story. That's like a novella. And I liked sort of the format of how it was written. It's sort of written like a plot summary of each episode. But there's 272 of them. So it kind of got a little tiring, and it went off the rails after a while. I was like, what is this even about? I don't know. And then that was kind of how I felt about the rest of the collection. It kind of went off the rails. It went from being, you know, a little bit weird and fantastical to being just completely like, what's even happening right now? I don't even know what's happening. And so I would say the first half of the first three stories were fairly successful for me, and then the middle was not so much, and then there was a couple stories at the end that I liked a little bit better again. But there's about 12 stories, I think, in total there, so it was one of those hit or miss things, which tends to happen for me for short story collections. So, you know, that's just how it went for me. It may be something that works for you. It's really definitely, each story is about women. They're women focused. They're about women's, you know, from women's point of views. The other thing I want to say about this is, if you are not a person that likes graphic sex on the page, I would skip this one. There is a lot of sex in this book, which I'm fine with, but it did feel at certain points like a little too graphic. It was a little too much at times. So if that is something that bothers you, I would probably say give this one a pass. So that's what I've read in April. All in all, a very successful reading month. I got a lot of great books read in amongst my busy work schedule and my vacation. I'm looking forward to maybe reading some lighter stuff in May. I feel like I've been reading a lot of heavy stuff, a lot of nonfiction and literary fiction, and so I have today actually started a romance novel, and so that I think is going to be a good palate cleanser for me. And I will be back with another video soon. I hope you're all doing well, and I will talk to you later.